Cycling, the use of a bicycle for sport, recreation, or transportation purposes. In the sport of cycling, there are professional races and amateur races, which are mostly held in continental Europe, the United States, and Asia. There is a widespread use of bicycles as recreational vehicles in Europe and the United States. The use of bicycles as a mode of transportation is particularly important in non-Western nations and in flat countries, some of whom, like the Netherlands, have a widespread system of bicycle paths available to cyclists. Cycling as a sport made its first official appearance on May 31, 1868, with a 200-meter, 312-yard race between the fountains and the entrance of Saint-Cloud Park near Paris. On May 31, 1868, James Moore, an 18-year-old expatriate Englishman from Paris, was the winner of the competition. It was on November 7, 1869, that the first city-to-city race was held between Paris and Rouen. Moore was again the winner, having covered the 135 kilometers, 84 miles, in 10 hours, 25 minutes, including time that he had spent walking up the steeper hills on his bicycle. As road racing became more common in continental Europe within a few years, in England, the deteriorated conditions of the roads made them unsuitable for road racing, so the sport there centered around track events and time trials, since the roads there were unsuitable for road racing. It is believed that the first race ever recorded in the United States took place on May 24, 1878 in Boston, 2 years after professional baseball was introduced to the country and 13 years before basketball was invented. Early American racing usually took place on tracks, in long races, sometimes involving pacers, who rode ahead of contestants at a fast speed and then began to drop off as they approached the finish line. By the 1890s, there were about 100 dirt, cement, or wooden tracks around the country, mainly in big cities. More than 600 professionals traveled on this national circuit, which ranged from Boston to San Francisco, with competitions in such cities as St. Louis, Salt Lake City, Denver, and Los Angeles. The sport received an enormous publicity boost on June 30, 1899, when one of these riders, Charles M. Murphy, rode on a wooden track behind a Long Island Railroad train and covered a mile in 57.8 seconds, earning the nickname of Mile-a-Minute Murphy. A particularly grueling form of racing flourished in the United States in the 1890s, the six-day race, 142 hours, since the races usually started at midnight and ended 6 days later at 10 p.m., of non-stop competition with prizes up to $10,000 and an international field of riders. This form of racing was transformed with the change from one-man teams to two-man teams in 1899, and six-day races retained their popularity well into the 1930s. While no longer held in the United States, these races continue to attract large crowds in Belgium, Italy, France, and Germany. Sport racing in the modern era. As a result of the improvements in road conditions in the 1890s, racing became a popular sport across Europe, which paved the way for the introduction of some of the one-day classics that continue to this day, for example, the Paris-Roubaix race. In addition to France and Belgium, races were also introduced in Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands after France and Belgium. As of 1903, when the 21-day Tour de France was inaugurated for the first time, it has been held every year except during World Wars I and II. This premier race is just seconds behind the Grand Tours of Italy, the Giro d'Italia, and Spain, the Vuelta a España, which are both three-week tours held in the summer. Usually the Giro is held between May and June, the Tour de France is held in July, the Vuelta is held in September, and the World Championships are held in October. Prizes in these races are substantial, amounting to $2.5 million in the Tour de France alone. European road racing was under the sponsorship of bicycle manufacturers until the late 1920s, when national and regional teams were introduced. Trade sponsors returned after World War II, but with the waning of bicycle manufacturers, teams began turning to various sponsors, including automobile manufacturers, insurance companies, and banks. The professional road racing season now begins in January, with races in Australia and Malaysia, continues from February through October in Europe and the United States, and closes again in Asia in November and December. For most riders, the season includes about 120 days of competition spread over 8 months. With the waning of six-day races during the Depression in the United States, American interest in cycling began to fade until the 1980s. American riders, competition, Nakano Koichi Racing at the 1986 World Track Championships. The sport is governed overall by the Union Cycliste Internationale, UCI, which is based in Switzerland, and by each country's cycling federation. Amateur races are held for both men and women in local, regional, and national competition by age group, ranging upward in age from competitors 12 to 13 years old. In the World Championships, amateurs are no longer differentiated from professionals among men, but the sport is divided into those under 23, called espoir, hopefuls, and those over that age. Categories of competition during the season include time trials, which can be an individual or team event, one day or classic, races in which distances can vary between 200 and 280 kilometers, 124 to 175 miles, for professionals, and 140 to 200 kilometers, 87 to 124 miles, for amateurs, and multi-day or stage races, basically a series of classic races run on successive days. The winner of a stage race is the rider with lowest aggregate time for all stages. Also popular, especially in Britain and the United States, are criterium races, which are run over a relatively short distance of 4 to 5 kilometers, 2.5 to 3 miles, for a succession of laps totaling up to 100 kilometers, 62 miles. Track racing events include the sprint, the pursuit, the 1 kilometer time trial, the points race, and the Kirin, or motor-paced race. Kirin is especially popular in Japan because betting on the outcome is legal there, much like a horse or dog race. Some European track stars ride on the Kirin circuit in Japan, both for the experience and for the salary. Cyclocross, or cross-country racing, established in the mid-1920s, covers rough terrain that may require racers to dismount and walk or run with their bicycles. Mountain biking over rough terrain, but usually downhill rather than on the flat, is increasingly popular. One difference between cyclocross and mountain bike racing is that cyclocross riders are allowed to ride up to 3 bicycles during a race, whereas in mountain bike competition, the cyclist must carry all the tools necessary to fix the bicycle, as only one bicycle may be used during a race. One other recent form of racing is bicycle motocross, BMX racing, which can be traced to motocross racing. Racers, children and adults, ride on dirt tracks which feature a large number of jumps and turns. BMX racing is very popular in the United States, Europe, and Australia. In 2008, BMX racing made its Olympic debut at the Beijing Games in the form of a men's individual race and a women's individual race. Doping, the use of performance-enhancing drugs, is considered to be widespread in cycling, especially after the scandal that shook the Tour de France in 1998 and resulted in the expulsion of one of the leading teams, the Festina team. To circumvent the medications prohibited by the UCI, many professional teams and individual riders employ doctors to administer drugs that are difficult to detect, such as erythropoietin, EPO, a hormone that acts to increase the level of red blood cells and thus the flow of oxygen to muscles. The UCI periodically checks riders for the level of red cells in their blood, with a limit of 50%, 55% for riders from high-altitude regions. Anything above that is regarded as an indication of the use of EPO and carries a 2-year suspension. Stimulants and anti-fatigue drugs such as amphetamines are detectable and therefore outmoded performance-enhancing drugs. Recreation cycling, as recreation became organized shortly after racing, did. In its early days, cycling brought the sexes together in an unchaperoned way, particularly after the 1880s when cycling became more accessible owing to the invention of the Rover safety bicycle. Public cries of alarm at the prospect of moral chaos arose from this, and from the evolution of women's cycling attire, which grew progressively less enveloping and restrictive. In modern times, recreational cycling has been a cornerstone in fitness campaigns, especially in the United States, where more than 65 million people are believed to ride regularly, including more than 6 million who use bicycles to commute. Bicycle and touring clubs abound in Europe, especially in France, Belgium, Italy, and England. Touring by bicycle, cyclotourism, is also on the increase worldwide. Bicycle paths have been created on the streets of many cities and in national as well as municipal parks, and in the United States more than 10,000 miles, 16,000 kilometers, of abandoned railroad corridors have been turned into bicycle paths. Transportation. Since its invention, the bicycle has always been an inexpensive and democratic form of transportation. The advent of the automobile slowed the growth of cycling as a means of conveyance in some Western societies, whereas in China and Southeast Asia, the bicycle has remained a very popular form of transportation. In Africa and several Central European nations, many people travel by bicycle. 1990s citizens and city planners in industrialized nations began to question the role of the automobile in urban life. Some observers blamed the problem of suburban sprawl in countries such as the United States directly on the rise of automobile-based planning and designs. International groups such as Critical Mass were formed to encourage traffic laws and city design more conducive to cycling. These are, of course, my opinions of various sources I have read, as I enjoy everything about cycling. If you enjoyed this video, please leave me a comment and a thumbs up. Thanks for watching. This has been Gary's Resolve.